I would say that the trend in the West, certainly, and now the rest of the world, has been we've seen a synchronization of these turnings, right? That's where we are, but it's global. It's now global.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm its founder and your host, Adam Taggart. History tells us that civilizations and societies boom, bust, and then rise anew to repeat the pattern. A pattern that demographer Neil Howe says is surprisingly predictable in both its timing and trajectory. Howe refers to these seasons of societal change as turnings and has famously declared that America is now well into a fourth turning, the bust part of its cycle, where the status quo falls apart, often chaotically, and is replaced by a brand new order. Well, in its first 100 days, the Trump administration has certainly made big, and some would say disruptive or even chaotic, strides in its attempt to replace the previous status quo with a new playbook, both domestically and internationally. So, is this the kind of textbook fourth turning upheaval that Howe expected? Well, to find out, as well as what further transformation he expects ahead, we'll ask the man himself. Neil, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Adam, nice to be here.
Hey, Neil, it is wonderful to have you here. Thank you. I've been really looking forward to today's conversation because I've interviewed you over the years. Um, I and most of this audience are very familiar with your work along with your partner about the fourth turning. Your latest book says that we're now well in it, and I think if people had any doubts about that coming into 2025, they don't anymore. We are definitely living through times of upheaval right now. Um, I've got so many questions for you, but why don't we start in the thick of things? So we've got this massive trade tariff war going on right now. In many ways, this really is indicative of a trend that we're seeing across the world, right? Where we're seeing the reversal, the end of globalization, and what Trump would say, the American subsidized world order, right? Here in America, Trump won. He's got MAGA, America First. We're seeing a lot of similar political parties arise elsewhere around the world. Whether it's Meloni in Italy, Milei in Argentina, the rise of Le Pen in France, or the popularity of AfD in Germany, just to name a few. Even today in Romania, where they basically they had run an election, a nationalist candidate essentially won, and they negated the election and then held it again, and then the next nationalist candidate won overwhelmingly. So, is this kind of the transition that you were expecting in this type of fourth turning? This whole shift from, hey, we're all going to work together, to this globalist world order, to no, it's my country first now.
Yeah, I think that definitely is the drift we've been seeing, and frankly, it's been building ever since the GFC.
Yep.
That was nearly 15 years ago. And Adam, we've been seeing this wave of populist, more authoritarian, ethnocentric heads of state around the world. This is not in any one country. We see it in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. We see it in South Asia, notably with India and Narendra Modi. We see it obviously in East Asia, seeing it increasingly in Latin America. So this is a global trend. This is a global generational trend, I should say, and it's what we should expect. It's what we should be anticipating. The decline of globalization really started at the end of the GFC, and it's now accelerating. And now we have the U.S. president, sort of the head of the Western alliance, right? The cornerstone of globalization, so to speak, historically, certainly after World War II, is changing course rather dramatically. And you're right. He says this whole globalization thing is something that, it's a bad deal for the United States. Obviously, the United States has gotten a lot out of having a prosperous democratic world order. If that is one of the things that's gone along with globalization, it certainly worked to our favor. And certainly having the dollar as a world reserve currency has been an enormous to quote Giscard d'Estaing, an exorbitant privilege that the United States has enjoyed for all these years. But we have a regime now in place which thinks it's a bad idea, and we're going to turn away from it. And I do believe that a lot of people were thinking that globalization went too far. For example, in deindustrializing a lot of America very suddenly with the rise of China. And perhaps China should not have been admitted to the global order, when in the manner it was.
Right.
So he has a lot of support. He has a lot of support for a lot of his agenda. I think on the bringing back, blue collar jobs to America, rolling back the non-legal immigration wave that we've seen over the past 15 years, especially over the past 3 years during the Biden administration, with the rise of the huge asylum backlog, which is basically how many of these people are made legal, right, so to speak, nominally legal. But so there's a popularity to a lot of what he's doing. There's also what you might consider a more conventional conservative side to this, cutting the size of government, cutting the size of government programs. And then there's some aspects of it, really not sure what box to put them in. We don't know what they are. We don't know what he wants to do with defense. I mean, presumably, like many good Republicans, certainly the heads of the armed services committees in both the House and the Senate, he wants to expand defense. How much, we don't know. But there are a lot of contradictions, and there's a lot of chaos surrounding it. One of the more chaotic elements is, of course, Adam, that is a lot of this stuff transcends the rule of law, right? Practically every element of it is going to confront the federal courts, right? So it's either in a district court or appeals court, or it's going to the Supreme Court right now. And you can go down the whole string of things. The law by which he's actually putting these tariffs into place, the law by which he's, rounding up, ICE is rounding up and getting rid of these immigrants who are in the United States, how he's kind of short-circuiting the Administrative Procedures Act when it comes to, regulations and so forth, the impoundment of funds. He thinks he has the power to just simply stop funding for a program or just scrap an entire program altogether. As many people have tried to remind Donald Trump, if you look at the Constitution, roughly 2/3 of it is Article 1. It's all about Congress. And somehow no one ever informed Trump that most of the Congress is about the powers of Congress, right? And the president is just supposed to, enact and be the executor of what the executive and Congress together agree on, right? So all of this is going to hit the courts. And so this remains a huge shadow looming over Trump's presidency, right? What's he going to do when the courts start giving, even a John Roberts court, even a John Roberts court filled with Federalist Society conservatives is going to say, no, Mr. President, Congress has to decide important questions. That is the major questions doctrine, which almost all of these conservatives believe in. Congress has to actually say something, right, for this to be constitutional. So that's going to be a huge issue coming down. By the way, a lot of these huge issues that are just sitting there, what's Trump going to do about that? And if you want to go into some of the other big issues coming down, Adam, we can just go over them because there's almost a timetable. In June, he's going to have to decide what to do about Iran. He's given an ultimatum to Iran. In July or August, he's going to have to decide what to do about the federal debt ceiling, right? That's coming up. And no later than September, they're going to put through that reconciliation budget resolution. And that looks like that could be Christmas in September. You know what I mean? We're going to have all kinds of goodies come through that because the Trump administration is sort of short-circuiting the reconciliation process, what I call the slow nuking of Congress, of getting either working through reconciliation or working through the Congressional Review Act to bring more and more items in the 50% majority and getting around the 60 filibuster in the Senate. This is the whole problem, by the way. Why isn't Trump using Congress to get more of his stuff? After all, he's got Republican majorities in both houses. The reason is the filibuster rule. We now have a country in which there are no moderates, right? You are either on one side or the other. And because he does not have 60 Republicans, every single Democrat will vote against every single thing he wants to do, right? So this means he can't do anything with Congress, right? So he would say, I mean, the way he would defend himself is, I was elected to do stuff. Congress is not going to allow me right now to do stuff with their Byzantine rules. And I talked with, you probably say, I talked with Thune, who's the majority leader, South Dakota, and he's told me all this mumbo jumbo about filibustering. I can't go against. So I'm going to start doing anything. I'm going to be the honey badger. You know what I mean? It's going to look ugly. It's going to look really ugly, and the headlines will be full. But I'm determined to keep acting. I was elected to act, and I'm not going to let excuses keep me from trying to get the job done that I was elected to do. Now, if he's able to get around the filibuster through these two important ways, one is by putting stuff into the reconciliation bill that is not normally there, or putting something into the Congressional Review Act. These are ways in which I consider to be a kind of a slow nuking of the filibuster. And I think we're on the way. I think ultimately the filibuster is a bad idea, particularly in a time like this. There comes a time at which you simply have to let a majority
govern.
Yeah, have to let a majority govern. One of the most famous passages decrying filibuster rules was written by Alexander Hamilton. I believe it was Federalist 22, and you can just say how unfair and how reprehensible it is that you should have a law that enables a minority to prevail over a majority. He said this always leads to incapacity and sclerosis and dysfunction. He said it should never be allowed to happen. Of course, Alexander Hamilton was very much in favor of energy in government, right? So he wanted government to be able to do what it should do. But I think all these things are coming up. So it's going to lead to a lot more chaos, perhaps, and a lot more upheaval. And we'll see what lies on the other side. We can talk a little bit about what he wants to do in the budget and tariffs and how all that is going to, whether all that's compatible with each other later on. But that's another interesting question.
All right. So I absolutely want to get into all of that. So great start to this, Neil. If I can, let me just ask you a couple of sort of lightning round questions, and then we'll get back into the meat of the guts here. So first off, Trump as this chaos agent, change agent, this honey badger, right? Who's just trying to find any which way to do what he needs to do, because the system kind of is thwarting him at every step, or wants to thwart him at every step. To me, that feels like classic fourth turning, right? You get this sclerotic system, and so you get people in there that have to start breaking it down to then create a new path for things to actually get done. So I'm assuming, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, while you might be as transfixed as the rest of us on the details and how is this movie going to play out, you're not. I don't think you're surprised by the script in terms of the way it's unfolding right now. True?
No, I'm not surprised at all. No.
Okay, you would have expected, whether it wasn't Trump himself, somebody like this eventually to get into the system during a fourth turning, right?
Yeah, and it will knock big things off the China shop shelves. and things will start breaking until you could get a real crisis, right? And at that point, that's when you really reshape institutions, right? In ways which become creative, right, and which point the way toward a new order. We haven't quite seen that yet, but we will eventually.
Okay, and I have a question about that I'm getting towards. Beforehand, your book, your original book, The Fourth Turning, it took sort of an American-centric view, right? Previous fourth turnings were World War II and the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. But there are echoes in other parts of the world history. Um, I deliberately started with this sort of question about globalization getting replaced with this rising nationalism, because we have more people than just Americans that watch these videos, and I want to convey to all of them that you have to care about this current fourth turning, and I think for two reasons. If it were American only, you'd still need to care about it because America is the biggest dog on the block, and what happens there is going to affect all of you. But as we said very early on here, this is not an American only phenomenon. We are seeing this in a growing number of countries around the world. So this time is the fourth turning kind of truly global.
Yes, I actually wrote more about that in the most recent book a couple of years ago. Certainly wrote more about global turnings and global
Hmm.
generations. And I would say that the trend in the West, certainly, and now the rest of the world, has been we've seen a synchronization of these turnings, right? The last fourth turning, which is really uh, the Great Depression and World War II, which involved total war or national revolutions in so much of the world, right? All of Europe, including Russia, South Asia. I mean, India obviously got its independence. I mean, China, with there was an enormous crisis and a revolution, and in Japan, and right. I mean, all of this, right? It was all part of a great fourth turning. And I would say also that in the late 60s, 70s, even into the 1980s in many parts of the world, we had what we call a second turning, an awakening, which was youth-led rebellions against a very stolid order built by World War II veterans.
Hmm.
And you had it with Indira Gandhi in India. You had it with the Cultural Revolution in China. Just thinking of all those people, right, born after World War II who tried to get rid of 3,000 years of Chinese civilization. By the way, in China now they're trying to bring all that back, right? Now they have Confucian institutes, and it's all about it's all about Han dining and Han cuisine and Han dress. So
Mm.
all these boomers, Xi Jinping's generation, who wanted to get rid of it all when they were young, they figured out there was one real advantage to this Confucian ethic. It said honor the old.
Yeah.
So, they're all bringing it back, but that is actually the pattern. That's the classic, second turning, fourth turning pattern. And we saw it and we think of the 60s as an American thing, but Americans do at least, but it was not. I mean, there was the there was the youth rebellion in Paris, in Prague, in Berlin. There was the Euro terrorism in Europe. It was
Mhm.
actually a lot worse in Europe than it was here. You had young people who were, blowing up bombs and stuff. You had the massacre of students in Mexico City, in Santiago, the disappearances of young revolutionaries throughout South America. So my point is, you had an enormous awakening, right? And this is how we define an awakening: is a youth-led rebellion against a system built by old people that frees up the system, right? Creates a new world of individualism, right? It degrades the establishment and creates a new, more individualistic order. We're going through in the fourth turning the opposite, right? Is where you have a world of individualism and you're rebuilding much more powerful civic institutions. So this is the second turning and the fourth turning, the awakening and the crisis, are social dynamics at the opposite ends of the cycle. You see what I mean? And
I,
that's
I,
where
I,
we are, but it's global. It's now global.
okay, so so you've answered my question there. It's now global. Help me understand this. So as I remember from our previous discussions, to the point you just made, um, you during a fourth turning, you get this tightening of top-down control. One, because the change agent and governments are trying to impose their new framework on things, but also you get a pull for it from the populace. The populace demands more of government to sort of solve the big intractable problems. I'm correct on that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just get this question in, which is, and maybe I'm thinking about this erroneously, but you might almost think of that as more collectivist, right? Hey, we're all in this together. We want the government to kind of tell us what to do. We'll all
Totally.
do it. Um, but if you look at least what's happening right now with with the MAGA movement, it really is all about kind of blowing up a lot of the progressive, liberal, you know, whether it's DEI, whether it's support programs, whether it's open borders and bring everybody in. It feels almost more like a disassembling of collectivist structures as opposed to an imposition of more collectivism.
Well, it depends how you look at it. The new White House wants to enforce a diversity of viewpoints in universities. Enforce a diversity of viewpoints. What does that sound like to you? When is the last time government actually intervened in monitoring viewpoints in a university? I mean, just think about that, Adam. The government's never really interfered at all with what universities do. We let academics kind of do what they do and govern themselves. This is new, you have to admit.
It is, and I'm just trying to think what the administration would say of that. Was they would say, "Well, look, it was a, you know, a viewpoint that we don't think is, it was a collectivist viewpoint that we don't think is helpful to the country, and we just don't want to fund that, right?" So they're saying you can teach it, we're just not going to give you state funds to teach it, right?
Yeah,
Now,
when you start stripping people of their tax deductibility, that means you're actually redefining them as something other than a university.
yeah,
That's
that is true.
that's a pretty institution killing threat, right?
Yep.
And I guess I would say a lot of these things, for instance, you're going to monitor trade. I mean, the old idea was, what was Adam Smith all about, right? Free trade. Just let people do what they want to do, right? Well, now you're going to have an industrial policy. Within the whole idea of a tariff regime is the whole idea implicitly of an industrial policy. You want a leader, a capo with real power, who's going to look after blue collar America, make sure they all have jobs. Not going to leave it to the marketplace, right? I think undeniably, this is a much more centralized administration, right? Someone who's going to protect you, going to shelter you, going to look after you. I mean, if some leader says that they're going to do that for you, presumably there's going to be a lot more top-down power. I see that absolutely is coming out of this, right? And I think you're right, by the way, about the rising generation believing that it's the system that's going to save them. I think one of the most interesting things about millennials is that they're all investing in target date funds. They're basically all just, they're all investing in the entire market, right?
Yep.
Because they're convinced that if they invest in any little, niche, actively invested fund, and that thing goes down, I don't know, filled with maybe some companies out of there in the Russell 2000, no one's going to care if they go bankrupt, right? But if they're invested like everybody else in the home market, someone will have to back them up. I mean, it's beautiful, right? I mean, if they go down 30%, well, the Fed and the Treasury, everyone's going to be there, right? So,
Yeah. I'm
so
just curious, is that a proactive choice, or is that just what we've trained the market to?
well, I think I think it's very much in the sensibility of the millennial generation to believe that. First of all, they believe in community so that it avoids the problem of being richer or poorer than your friends. You all
Right.
go up
Yeah.
or down together,
Yeah.
which is very different because Gen Xers, when they were in their 20s and 30s, their attitude was only a few of us are going to survive.
Yeah.
I want to be on that one thing that's above, in other words, with Gen Xers, the lifeboats all headed out in different directions, right? Knowing that only a few of them are still going to be afloat. With the millennials, they're tying the lifeboats together.
Together. That's a great analogy. And I can see that. So, I think you can definitely say this administration has a much clearer sense of the framework that it's trying to build or rebuild the country in, and it is going to be very firm in terms of how it imposes that framework. I would say, and this isn't necessarily in contradiction to what you're saying. Parts of that framework are things like deregulation and tax cuts and stuff like that that aren't like heavy-handed, traditional sort of like collectivist programs, but the framework I can see is rigid, and Trump is looking to impose it, and I think more of his followers want him to impose it. Um, Trump, calls all this together the new golden age. That's what I'm trying to bring around, right? And this is, let's secure our national security, right, through defense and through better trade deals and stuff like that. Let's stimulate the economy through better trade deals, through tax cuts, through deregulation, through rebuilding our manufacturing base, getting more foreign capital invested here. It wants to, reduce the size of government and government spending, reprivatize the economy, as Besant would say. So is all of that together, that kind of plan for a golden age, could that golden age be the first turning that emerges from all this?
Well, a golden age is a first turning, but of course, whether or not Trump secures it and when that will come about,
Totally up for grabs. I'm
well,
not saying it's going to be, but could it be? Is it a contender to be a first turning here?
no, because
Okay.
I don't even think the timing is right. I mean, the first turning
Okay.
is something that's going to happen, at least in my reckoning, something in the 2030s, right? And I don't see we're close to that. There's some huge contradictions in what you just laid out, Adam. I mean, for example, he wants there to be no trade deficit, but he wants everyone to invest in America. How's that going to work?
Yeah.
How are you going to get capital inflows with us having a net exports over import? I mean, you know what I mean? It doesn't work. That's not not how flows work. In fact, I would say one of the biggest problems that's going to come up, I think, this year is one fundamental contradiction, and that is that it's not necessarily a contradiction. It's something that just simply hasn't been thought through, I think, in the Trump administration. And that is, if you are going to shut down trade flows, that means of necessity, you're shutting down credit flows, right? So you're shutting down
Yep.
capital flows. Well, what are the capital flows currently, right? There are huge amounts of foreign lending coming into the United States to sustain our completely abysmally low national savings rate. And the fact that we're running a 6% of GDP deficit at the
Hmm.
peak of the business cycle, if we go into an next recession, that's going to go up into the double digits. Completely unsustainable, Adam. So my point is that the only reason it's affordable at all, why we can run these deficits, is we're getting all this foreign credit, which is the flip side of our trade deficit. You see where this is going, Adam.
I
If
do.
you start clamping down on the trade flows, you clamp down on the inflows of credit. And at the same time, if you're blowing up the deficit, what does that do to real interest rates? What does that do to the 10-year? We saw that, you remember, on Liberation Day. Do you remember that? We
Yep.
saw the
Well, sure.
30-year and the 10-year suddenly spike upward, and the dollar has been going down. And I think this is the problem that people have to come to grips with, that if you really want an America to be a net exporter and a huge investor in domestic industries, we need a hugely higher savings rate than we currently have. And the first step you need to do that is to close the federal deficit, right? And unfortunately, that's not what Trump is going to be doing. He's going to be blowing it out. I don't know if you've seen the recent discussions on the budget resolution and the reconciliation bill. They want to add the excuse to actually blow that thing out, right?
Right.
We're going to be cutting taxes, investing more in defense, and who knows what little bits of corner bits and pieces we'll be able to cut from Medicaid. You know what I mean? Not much, right?
Right.
So this is, to me, a contradiction. You cannot eliminate trade and therefore credit flows from the American economy while running up the deficit like that. We will literally have nothing left to invest in capital spending in America. And for the first time in a long time, we could be really talking about crowding out and capital shortages, right? And we have not talked about that a long time in America. Why? because we've been running huge trade deficits. We've been having all this foreign capital. So you get where I'm coming from, Adam. Let me just add this one point. As long as Donald Trump, and you know, I congratulate him for this, is willing to brook near-term pain for long-term gain, which I think is a laudable idea, right? And he said that recently. Maybe they won't have $20 for Christmas next year. Maybe only $2. You know,
$2 versus 30. Yeah.
yeah. Or as someone is doing a recent Soprano taping, it will call him $2 Donnie. You know. Anyway, or Donnie $2. You know. Anyway, but my point is, as long as we're willing to do that, why don't you spend the pain on cutting the deficit? And the Republicans would hugely back you on that, right? He would have no problem getting his entire party to vote for that agenda. You see what I mean? But instead, it's kind of, he's trying to work one side on the trade and another side on the deficit. It's not going to go down well together, Adam. And I think pretty soon they're going to see this. I mentioned earlier on this show that bit about Christmas in September.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're planning for. Why? Why do I call it Christmas? Huge tax cuts and a lot of spending increases. And now, if we're in recession by then, well, then you might say, well, some of that might be good economic policy. But sooner or later, Adam, we need to get off of this course we're on when it comes to national savings. It will kill us.
Okay, so super interesting and important. And there's sort of a micro point and a macro point here I want to underscore. Maybe I'll do the macro one first, which is you said you really don't expect the first turning, the model of the first turning to really become clear, we'll say, by the 2030s? Early
2030s is when we expect the fourth turning to begin, sometime around that. I'm just quoting my own book here.
Yep. Okay. And I guess, I mean, I guess that's not super far in the future, right? We're talking 5+ years at this point in time. But sort of history would say it's a little too early for something to emerge yet here. So
well, history also suggests we need some sort of conflict, right? We need something that would really ensure that people actually reshape institutions for a reason.
All right.
And public mobilization. Now, it's interesting whether or not that could occur in response to an economic crisis. Typically, historically, it's occurred because it's
been kinetic, right?
Yeah, it's been kinetic conflict. But look, Adam, we haven't talked about some of the darker outcomes. I mean, what if Trump has a huge confrontation in the Supreme Court? He does an Andrew Jackson. He just basically says, well, John Roberts has made his decision. Let him enforce it.
Let him enforce it. Yeah.
So if he does that, what are the Democrats going to do? I can envision a scenario where the Democrats will say, well, wait a second. We're not doing anything through Congress. And you've just basically said we're going to rule without the courts. Why are we even sitting here in this institution, right? We're going to all start meeting up in Lake Placid, New York or something. You know what I mean? You see where I'm going with this?
I do.
And by the way, I think if the Democratic start doing that, they would actually get a lot more respect from Americans than they do currently when they just sit there doing nothing. At least they'll have a backbone. They'll show that they're doing something, right? They'll show that they're in opposition, but you see where this is going, right, Adam?
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So I totally get that scenario. I imagine you don't get the type of mobilization of change for a fourth turning until the majority of the populace feels the pain and responds to it, right? So whether it's that scenario or any others, kind of the general question I have for you is right now, what do you see as the biggest contenders for that pain that's going to cause the mobilization? Is it we get into war with China? Is it that the Democrats? I mean, for the Democrats to mobilize against the Trump administration, if Trump kind of goes King Trump, like you're saying, there's got to be some big enough pain for the majority of Americans to say, all right, time for me to stop doing what I'm normally doing and grab my pitchfork.
Yeah. Well, yeah, what if I like going King Trump? Yeah, that's an
Yeah.
interesting way to put it. And let's say that happens in the middle of a recession. So maybe people aren't too happy about the way things are going, right?
Okay.
So that's one scenario. And I think another scenario would be external. And we see a whole bunch of things in the world right now. I already mentioned the Iran ultimatum.
Hmm.
We have India and Pakistan sitting there somehow. Just recently came up last week, and obviously China, which looks increasingly like it's not going to be invasion; it's going to be a strangulation. You know what I mean? It's going to be
Yep.
some sort of embargo or uh, I don't know. China will start inspecting all the ships coming in and out to Taiwan as sort of a slow strangulation, and try to avoid that coming to a conflict. You see what Trump will do. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Um, these things are all very dangerous. One thing I point out, looking at the history of fourth turnings, is this question of where you go, domestic or internal or external, is decided actually very late in the fourth turning. This is
Mm.
actually not something that's easy to predict, as indeed it was with the Great Depression, World War II. Great Depression, as you may know, was a period of enormous internal polarization in the United States. I mean, half
Right.
of America thought that we were living in the fascist decade. The other half thought we were living in the communist decade. No one believed there was any future for sort of liberal capitalism. We had violent labor strikes in 1936, 37. And people thought this nation was coming apart. They thought many people thought FDR was playing as a dictator. And if you would ask most Americans on the street in 1938, as late as 1938 or 1939, if there's a big crisis in the future, what would it be? They probably would have said, well, if there's a big crisis, probably going to be, right versus left in America, the
Like a
popular
civil war.
front against, yeah. But of course, it turned out to be something very different, right? The rise of fascism, the defeat of France, the Battle of Britain, and then suddenly everything changed, right? America became the arsenal of democracy, and eventually Pearl Harbor and all the rest of it. It's amazing how profoundly isolationist we were as a country right up until that point, right?
Yep.
How hard that would have been to anticipate that shift for us.
And do you feel likely
And by
now
the
that
way,
it's
I bring that
yeah,
up. It seems newly relevant because one of the most popular Republicans at that time was Charles Lindbergh, who was one of the heads
America
of the
first?
America First Committee, which
Yeah.
the budget resolution that now sitting there, the reconciliation resolution, is called the American First Budget Resolution. So this is how history literally comes back. You see what I mean?
I do. And so I kind of almost take from what you're saying is like, look, don't even try to get too fancy about trying to figure out what's going to be the thing that really, brings us to the unwinding of the fourth turning because it's probably anybody's guess right now.
Yeah, but you do see how the potential energy is there. That's the
Yes.
thing, right? It's like you see how all the pieces are potentially in place. You just don't yet know what the catalyst is going to be to
Right.
unleash that energy.
Right. And we don't know whether it's going to be focused inward, an implosion, or outward, an explosion, right? We
or
just can
some or
feel it
some
building.
com or some combination, right? We've had fourth turnings that were some combination of internal and external at the same time. You think
Okay.
about it, the American Revolution, was that an external conflict of the American colonies against Parliament and King George, or was it internal? Actually, most of the killings in the American colonies were American patriots killing American Tories. You know what I mean?
Tories,
So
right. Yeah.
there was a huge amount of internal violence, particularly in the South, which was mostly Americans killing Americans. But it was also somewhat, you see what I mean?
I
So
do.
looking at fourth turnings actually is fascinating because you begin to see they all have both internal and external conflict dimensions.
Okay. So All right, I'm trying to rejigger the questions here because I want to go for like 3 more hours, and obviously we can't. So let me get back to the micro, and then I want to get into the sort of so what, right? Which is with with what we know, essentially these building pressures, um, and what we know we don't know, right? Which is we just don't know what the catalyst is going to be and how this is going to manifest when it really goes big. What can people be doing today to minimize their vulnerability to it? But let's hold off on that just for a few seconds. So on the micro side, I kind of detect from you, Neil, a general sense of skepticism that the new Trump administration is going to succeed in the way that at least they are telling us right now with the current set of policies, because you see several of those policies kind of at odds with each other.
Yes, I do. And, history will have a way of working that out. I think, you know, Hegel, I should quote Hegel here, that great, 19th century German idealist, but he used to talk about the cunning of history. And he said these figures like Napoleon and Caesar and so on, they unleashed things that had to be unleashed, but they didn't know what they were unleashing. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's as though the cunning of history is that these people play an absolutely indispensable role, but where history goes was not really in something they entirely understood. And I think Trump can be legitimately seen as that kind of figure, a necessary figure, right? And will unleash something, is in the process of unleashing something pretty primal. Where it goes, though, I don't think even Trump understands. And to his credit, I think Trump often doesn't even claim to understand it.
Yeah.
When you look back at, I think one of the best guides to thinking about how Trump operates was his original Art of the Deal, which was back in the 1980s, right? And he basically talked about it. He says, I usually have 13 balls in the air at the same time. Most of them I know will fail. I just see which ones work. I, I mean, here's a guy who's disarmingly honest about
Hmm.
how his mind functions. He just tries to open a lot of doors, bangs on them, see which ones will open. I think we saw that same thing recently with Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine. We banged on that door a little bit and said, well, probably we're not going to have the kind of peace I thought. So I don't know, let's do a deal. And that way, then, a deal on minerals, right? That way,
Right.
Ukraine is partly ours, and maybe now we'll defend it. You know what I mean? I mean, kind of willing to go anyway that things happen. Sort of that's the way the ball's turned out on that one. Now let me move on to Iran.
Yeah. And I think that
See,
sounds actually quite fair from what we've observed.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And coming from the business world, and you and I, guys, like, it's not that different from the VC model. I mean, we've seen lots of
yeah.
analogies of that.
You try everything, and in a way, this is a famous quote by Winston Churchill. Americans almost always do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. And you
So,
have to say that Donald Trump is busy exhausting a lot of alternatives, right?
yeah. So, all right. So, but to the point I made, which is, it sounds like your counsel to the general person would be don't expect uh, don't expect this current rollout of the new golden era, policy suite, um, to end up where we're kind of being sold it's likely to. You just think there's A, too many conflicts in there, and B, too many unknowns, and C, the guy who's running it, you know, it's all going to come down to which two or three of the balls land well versus the 10 others that, oh, okay, forget those.
But I will say this: the world will not be the same after Trump. You
Mhm.
know what I mean? A lot of these things he's pushing toward barriers, toward walls. I mean, we are going to be a more protected economy. We are going to be more autarkic, to use an economist word, right?
Yep.
Less trade. There's going to be, and as a consequence, less capital inflow. Now that may be necessary as a condition to get our fiscal house in order. Maybe first thing we need to do is wean ourselves off foreign credit inflows so that we are compelled to actually do something about our budget. You see what I mean? This is the cunning of history, Adam. In other
Yep.
words, you work yourself into a position where suddenly you have to tackle issues that earlier you hadn't tackled. But I do believe this new world, this more protected America, this with greater barriers both to labor and to trade, and therefore to credit as well, is going to be a lasting shift. And it will redefine America, both its sense of itself and its role in the world.
So, when I think about the fourth turning and I hear you talk about it, to me, it reminds me a lot of plate tectonics, which is like these are just the shifting of these major forces, and they are going to happen, right? And everybody else is just sort of figuring out how to play their role at the time that these shifts are happening. And so, a guy like a Trump, to use your words, um, he's just the guy there that let the shift happen. But
It's
it's
yeah,
like
and these shifts happen. Of course, the potential energy builds up, and then you have an earthquake or a volcano. Suddenly things move. In other words, it's a punctuated equilibrium, right? There's no change, and then suddenly, boom, things
right.
shift quickly,
It
right? I
it
mean,
shifts, right. And to your point, like you made the comment that somebody has to unleash that force, right? And
yeah,
so Trump's just the guy right now who's unleashing these current set of forces here in the world right now, right? But if it weren't him, it would
it
have been
would
somebody else because
it
those
would be
forces
somebody
would
else.
build up
Yeah.
to the point where they would have to unleash, right?
So history, I think, you know, makes the leaders we have. To answer the old question, are leaders born or made? I think leaders are made.
Yeah.
And history requires them. Ultimately, they realize they only have certain options, and those are the options they have. Those are the options they play. Some presidents, to the end of their term, always complain that they never had a crisis. I mean, Bill Clinton used to do that. Oh my God, what happened in the 1990s? Almost
Right.
nothing. You know what I mean? Except just before, well, the end of the Cold War, just before Bill Clinton became president. But the point is, he always used to complain, I never really could do much. We never had a real crisis. About Monica Lewinsky was
Right. The biggest
yeah,
crisis. Yeah.
exactly. But my point is that other generations, other leaders are very unprepossessing when they come in. I mean, FDR, everyone considered him to be kind of a second-rate intellect. He certainly wasn't he didn't understand anything about the economy. Unlike Herbert Hoover was a virtual, Herbert Hoover was a very impressive guy. Um, uh, FDR's second cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, everyone knew he was a dynamo. He wrote books. He was larger than life.
Right.
No one really had much of an impression. Many of the impressions were pretty were 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 not very good of FDR and his capacities, but he grew in response to the crisis that he faced. And it was certainly history that made him, right? I think you could say the same thing for Abraham Lincoln. I mean, Abraham Lincoln's entire leadership experience consisted of a very unsuccessful one term in the House of Representatives as a Whig who protested feebly and in vain against the Mexican-American War. And that was kind of it. I think otherwise his entire executive experience was running a two-man lawyer, law office. That was it. And yet suddenly he's thrust into the presidency, and look at how he did, right? Um, anyway, that's my point. But I think that anyone who espouses, as I do, a fundamentally cyclical notion of social moods and of generations and how they push social moods forward, right? Generational aging and how that pushes social moods forward, almost has to believe that leaders serve more as a catalytic function than as a sort of an independent force in moving off in their own direction, right?
Right. They're catalysts, but in many ways they react to the forces of history. They don't drive them, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And to the extreme part of that, and I don't know if you would totally agree with this, but it's almost like in many cases they just don't have a choice, right? The given the
They don't have a
forces of the
choice.
moment that it turns out they can only make the one choice that history remembers them for.
And I think also to Donald Trump's credit, some leaders see the future better than others. And I think one of the things that's most impressive about Donald Trump, when you consider his career, is that he saw the future better than the leaders of either party when
Hmm.
it came to this long-term move against globalization, and and as well as this long-term move toward populism, and the populization that was going to occur in the Republican Party, and how the Republican Party, its great opportunity was to steal the working class from the Democratic Party,
Right.
even if it had to give up professionals along the way. And third, this longer term move toward conservative values, which I think you're seeing, uh, is something that he was convinced that would happen, right? He was convinced that history was headed these ways, and history has headed that way. So I think in that sense, I mean, how was it that we ended up today with Donald Trump president rather than this being, Jeb Bush's second term or something like that? You know what I mean? I mean,
Yep.
how did history look back in 2016? And how would people have figured on Donald Trump's long-term odds versus a lot of other people? And you can see how, from that perspective, he showed a lot of prescience. And I think the ability to look forward is another thing that really helps a leader negotiate these turnings.
Okay. Yeah. And that, I mean, that's a great point, which is, back in 2016, a lot of the nationalism and sort of, revival of conservative values, both in the West and in the East, as you were saying earlier with China, it was not as clear then as it is now. So yeah, he was definitely a real early adopter, if you can say. All right. So Neil, um, if the folks who are watching here, I think they're both finding this super fascinating, but my guess is there's a little bit of an unease in their gut because if they're taking the same things away that I'm taking from you, which is kind of like, hey, as disruptive as things have gotten this year, as chaotic as some people might think things have gotten, I think you would say, hey, folks, you ain't seen nothing yet. And because we don't know how this is going to manifest in the end, and to your point, it may very well be something that we can't even really identify or imagine at the moment. There's a real sense of unease and vulnerability around that. And look, to a certain extent, we're all just going to have to wait to see how this script plays out and react to it. But let's focus more sort of economically. Where do you think, if you had to take your best guess right now, where do you think things are going to happen head economically, market-wise? And are there any sort of trends or behaviors that people could adopt now that will make them a little less vulnerable to the future disruption that's going to happen?
Yeah, there are a lot of things we could say about that. One of them is, I certainly believe is a long-term trend over the next 10 years, inflation is to worry about, right? Inflation in a crisis is not a problem, it's a solution. It's a way of sharing burdens.
Hmm.
And it's very important to understand that if we ever have to mobilize, if we have to start consuming less and investing more, either paying back our debts or paying for defense or doing all the other things, net exports or whatever we have to do, inflation is a way of equalizing burdens. What do? You take away from creditors, anyone
Yep.
who's anyone who's purchased a nominal bond. So I would say this tells you the kinds of assets to stay away from. Those that are, fixed income securities, I think history suggests is a bad bet. Um, I would also say volatility is going to be continually underrated moving forward. And that gives the opportunity for certain kinds of, tail hedging strategies, certain kinds of straddles. I think the idea of sudden huge moves in the market that we've certainly seen recently, right, both on the downside and the upside, is something that if you know that the VIX, as high as it is, could actually be underestimating the volatility over the next 3 or 6 months, that actually gives you an idea of trades you can make, right? I mean, certainly I was telling people, if you think of, you remember when we were back at like 12, the VIX
Yeah.
was at 12. And I said, my God, I mean, if just
And it was
imagine.
like a dead animal. You could poke it all day long and it wouldn't go anywhere. Yeah.
Exactly. But imagine if you had done a 3 month or 6 months put, at 20% off the market price and on the SPY. I mean, just imagine what you would have done. I mean,
Yeah,
you would
that's
have
right.
an enormous return. And my point is that we're entering a period like this where those kinds of returns are possible. And I also think this is a longer subject, but I also think the very um, composition of our economy will shift, and that has huge implications for what kind of equities to invest in. I think you have to think more about, less um, uh, discretionary consumption, and a lot more investing, particularly, for instance, you're mobilizing for conflict. Just think of all the manufacturing, right? Think of all the defense ETFs have done superbly over the past 3 or 4 years, Adam. and and that trend is not stopped. That's going to continue, right?
Yeah. So
Uh,
defense infrastructure, I would imagine you'd put energy in there.
and
For,
materials,
yeah.
materials of all kinds. I mean, materials always are huge in fourth turnings because everyone's building stuff. Remember, there's a fourth turning. We rebuild the public world. We're actually building things. This is Peter Thiel's vision. You remember that?
Yeah.
Instead of just characters, we actually will be building those actual things that will take us places, right?
Yeah.
So this is moving from the fourth turning and eventually into the first turning, is actually building a new world out of real things. This is a very different focus in the experience economy that we've been spending most of the last 20 years in when it comes to equities.
Okay. And back to energy, but building things. So, I mean, well, do you see AI as sort of being a critical front on the national security side here going forward? Meaning the country that wins AI will have a huge leg up on everybody else, and you need energy to feed the AI.
Look, AI is important, but it may be overpriced. You know what I mean? Because
Mhm.
everyone's been on AI. And I think people are on AI more because of the whole discretionary economy side, all the ways it'll make our lives easier. It'll choose all our entertainment for us and choose our
Yeah.
vacations. Um, and AI will be important. It's just I'm not sure it's priced at a point that it makes sense to invest in separately. I think
Yeah.
I think individual AI, companies, although some of them, particularly some of the defense-related AI companies, are so astronomical in price. Some of the companies I'm talking about.
I do.
I
I
mean,
do.
so that's more of a judgment call because
Okay.
those companies tend to be very expensive.
That's where you get price is what you pay, value is what you get. You might be paying such a high price today that even given the opportunity, the value is not good right now.
Right. But
Yeah.
there are a lot of other things. For instance, if we have a real crisis which involves some kind of public mobilization, remember that in any kind of major power conflict, the United States will not be protected as it has been in past wars. You know what I mean? There are ways in which our life here can be affected,
Affected.
whether through this, cyber wars
Mhm.
or God knows EMPs or, satellite attack. I mean, who knows what might actually happen, right? So, in other words, we may face problems here at home, and I think that's something very few Americans think about. Although I must say that the billionaire class thinks about them because they all have bunkers set up in
Bunker.
the
Yeah.
South Sea Islands, right? So it's amazing to me that so many people don't discount that possibility. But I always wonder why, everyone from Bill Gates to Oprah Winfrey are building these enormous underground caverns out in other places of the world. So they're preparing for something, so that obviously registers somewhere on their frequency distribution of outcomes, right?
So you would then be long personal resilience heading into this future. Put in a victory garden. Get to know your neighbors a little bit more. Work on your social capital. That type of stuff.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm currently writing a book on that. That's my next book. It's sort of on what to do, right, for this new period.
Oh,
So
really? Well,
yeah,
I,
that'll
I'm
be
gonna
out.
I'm gonna
that'll be out next year. That's a Simon and Schuster, just like my last book. So
All right. Well, I'm going to send you. You probably you already have the same ideas in your head, but I will send you the book that I co-authored, gosh, about 10 years ago, which was very much on that topic. So if there's
oh,
any even little seeds of there you can steal, please do.
please, yes.
All right. So given the fact that you know, we may be physically building this world of tomorrow, I imagine that commodities might be something you think are worth holding in this space, especially
Totally,
because you also
for
think
both
inflation is going to
reasons.
be big too,
Inflate,
right?
yeah, both on the inflation end and on the actual, holding, goods rather than services. Yes, I think, and how to invest in commodities, that's a whole nother discussion. There are various ways you can do it. At the very least, um, historically futures have done much better than spot. And also you need to have a very wide index because that you have just tremendous volatility drag
Right.
on a single commodity. So those are some basic rules, Adam. But as a class of things, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, folks, do your own homework. You know, if you're not experienced investing in this space, find an expert who is and learn from them. Um, I would imagine, while it's a commodity, it's a little bit different because it's got monetary purposes. But gold, I would think you would think would be good in this type of future as well.
As ever, and we'll
As ever.
see. I mean, we'll see that the dollar hasn't been looking very good, right? And that's that whole problem of what the rest of the world is going to think about investing in America. Uh, but gold, as just like defense ETFs, right, has done very well as we've been moving into this new era, of liberation, and it will probably continue to do well. Now, let me just say, these are all longer term trends, Adam. There is a possibility that this year we could be moving into a recession, right?
Absolutely.
And if that happens, you're going to have to judge these medium to long term trends with the possibility that short term we may go into something where, holding bonds temporarily might be good, right? Interest rates would go down. In other words, some of these things may reverse a little bit near term, not so much the sectoral shift of America, but some of these financial, particularly in the area of interest rates. You may actually find it. For example, if your idea to take advantage of rising inflation, rising real rates, is to go out and short a bunch of 10-year bond indexes, later this year might not be a good time to do that. You see what I mean? So
I do. And so, a couple of things. First off, it's obvious to the viewers, but none of what you're saying is personal financial advice for people. So
yeah,
obviously, folks,
yeah,
do your homework, work with an advisor. Secondly, you're kind of giving us, you know, the shopping list that you think will do well over the next 5, 10 years as we go through the fourth
yeah.
turning into the first. Obviously, there's going to be, you know, lots of wiggles and waggles along the way there. Um, and so, yeah, so you know, folks, on any given day, don't hold Neil to any of this stuff. He's talking with a long arc. You know, judge it a decade from now. And yeah, I mean, we didn't really have too much chance to get into the dangers of recession, but I'm gonna guess you're gonna say it's certainly a non-trivial risk here, both for some of the reasons you've already flagged around some of the inconsistencies that you see in the Trump policy rollout. But I could make the argument, and I think you would agree with me that even before the election in November, we could have talked about a recession this year just from the sins of the past catching up with us, correct?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, last year and a half, I mean, we had an inverted yield curve. We had the U.S. was tighter than the rest of the world. I mean, I I I I I have been doing a indicator show, and I go over these every month, and we had so many long term recession indicators that were up over most of late 2023, 2024, going into 2025, right? So it's almost as though we were overdue already before Trump. That's my point.
Hmm.
And you look at you look at the yield curve, 90-day, 10-year, still inverted. We're still flirting with going from an inversion back to sort of, back to normal, which is almost typically a sign that you're actually in a recession, right? So my, I guess my point is also you're suddenly stopping all the inflow of foreign labor, right? So I think the
Mhm.
impact on employment is going to be huge because we now know over the past 2 years, the biggest contribution to employment growth was foreign-born workers, right?
Right. And sorry to interrupt, but just to put a quick clarification there, we're stopping the inflow of illegal foreign-born labor. There is still foreign labor coming into the country, but it is a small fraction of what the total volumes were when you
Right.
added illegals. Yeah.
Yes. So CPS actually has a question every month on their, on their where they track unemployment and everything else. They ask, "Are you born in the United States?" So that is very simple. So we have actually been able to track that. Well, the foreign-born growth rose hugely, over
Right.
those post-COVID, you know, uh, 2 years, 2.5 years, and that was responsible for more than half of all U.S. employment growth. You're right. I mean, some of that growth, certainly in just absolute terms, is legal, but a large share of that was
The
uh,
vast majority. And
yeah,
I think the May jobs number was the first jobs report in I don't know how many years where we actually saw um, a decrease in jobs by foreign-born workers and an increase in domestic-born workers. It was like the first time we've seen an increase in jobs of domestic-born workers in a long time. So, clearly shutting the border was the catalyst for that.
yeah.
All right. Well, look, Neil, like I said, I could go easily for another 2 or 3 hours, but hopefully we scratch folks' itch enough because, Neil, after about 3 months of you not being on this program, the emails start fast and furious. When are you getting Neil on next? When are you getting Neil on next? And there's always so much to try to boil down into in just the hour that we have. But I think you've done a great job today. So thank you. Um, I'll reach back out to your assistant and try to get you back on another quarter or two. I will just say though, if there's something that happens that changes the calculus for you materially, a tectonic shift that the next tectonic shift or whatever, and you've got some insight that you want to get out into the world. I know you've got your own platforms, but if you want to amplify it by coming on here, you've got a blank check to come on here anytime, you want to call an audible.
That's great. Thank you, Adam. I've always enjoyed your show. It's and I've always I learned a lot from your questions. So thank you.
No, you're such a good guy. Well, look, the most important question is for folks that want to follow you in your work between now and the next time you're on this channel, where should they go?
Well, I do a weekly podcast on demography unplugged. So it's a Substack. So it's just Google demography unplugged, and you got it.
All all right. So I will put the URL to the Substack up here on the screen when I edit it, Neil, so folks know where to go. I'll also put the link in the description below the video. You're also on X as well, right?
I am, and that's just how generation.
All right, great. And I'll put that up on the screen too. All right. Well, look, folks, if you've been as thrilled to have Neil on this program as I have, please let him know that by hitting the like button, then clicking on the subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. Very importantly, if you want to try to prepare your portfolio for the road ahead, as Neil has described it to us as best he can right now, if you don't already have a great track record as a successful DIY investor through tumultuous times like it sounds like we're going to be going through for the next several years, highly recommend most people then work on constructing that type of portfolio with the benefit of a good professional financial advisor's advice, particularly from an advisor who takes into account all the macro issues that Neil has talked about here. If you don't have one who's already doing that for you, consider talking to one of the ones that Thoughtful Money endorses. These are the firms you see with me on this channel week after week. To schedule one of those free consultations, just fill out the short form at thoughtfulmoney.com. Only takes you a couple seconds to fill out the form. These consultations are totally free. There's no commitment to work with the firms. It's just a service that they offer. Neil, I know it's hard to sort of put a nice bow on something as big as a fourth turning, but are there any bits of parting counsel that you would have for the folks watching this video, most of whom, we do have some professional investors that watch, but most of whom are just regular people who are just trying to protect their family's economic and I mean, I guess in the fourth turning, just their family's general well-being through what's likely to happen ahead?
I My only advice would be when you talk to financial professionals, pay most attention to those that talk a lot about absolute return and don't get sidetracked in looking at the relative return to other indexes, right?
Mm.
If people talk about relative return, they probably, lashed and bound themselves, right, to the S&P 500, and you don't want to be at the mercy of where that goes. You see what I mean?
I
So
absolutely do.
you constantly hear people saying, well, I do, I got an information ratio, or I do this much better than, this index. Well, what if all the indexes don't do very well, right? So this is a space I'm in now, Adam.
Yep.
You really need to think about someone who's into wealth preservation and someone who's into guaranteeing you some sort of positive absolute return. You have to be able to persuade someone that if things go bad, you're going to do better than just investing in T-bills, right?
Yep. And presumably in this type of era, risk management, um, intelligently using hedges, things like that. So prioritizing a bit more
Exactly.
of first take no losses, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
totally. And how to do that as an art, and obviously some of you can't sum up in a few seconds, but I guess my advice is simply in judging the overall come on of a financial advisor. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
All right. Well, very wise words, Neil. Thanks so much. Like I said, look forward to having you back on later this year to give us an update then. But just speaking for not just my viewers, but everybody that follows your work, thank you for chronicling all this. You give us a framework that helps us make sense of the chaos. And while it is a little scary that things are likely to get worse, given how your framework's constructed, it's on the way to a better new order, and you give us that light at the end of the tunnel. So thank you.
Thank you for having me on, Adam.
All right, Neil, and everybody else, thanks so much for watching.